Very good. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual tour of the Holy Land that I've called The Journey to the Cross. My name's Campbell, Batson, and I work for the 4 o'clock service at St Helen's Church. Tour should last about an hour or so, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A at the end if you'd like to stick around. Now, here we have a map of Israel. I'm going to be using Google Maps for the entirety of the tour, and I'm going to begin in Jerusalem here in the capital city, at the site of the Pool of Siloam. So I'll try and just zoom in not too quickly there. Switch to satellite view. And we'll grab the little man. Now, the Pool of Siloam is mentioned in John's Gospel in chapter 9 as a public pool in Jerusalem that Jesus tells a blind man to go and wash in. But until quite recently, its exact location wasn't known. There was a public pool in Jerusalem that archaeologists thought might have been the Pool of Siloam that dated back to the Byzantine period, clearly, but they weren't quite sure. And it was only until 2004, quite recently, that this site was excavated, which is a much more probable candidate for the Pool of Siloam. If you have a look down the far end here, we can go down the far end, you can see a big black sewer pipe running along the length of this wall. That's because work began on the excavation of a new sewer in 2004, and as a part of that, it unearthed these steps, which we can see if we go back to the other end again, just down in front of us here, where I'm pointing the arrow. And they excavated a little further. As you can see, they've only partially excavated. There's still a whole bank here, which is on top of where the pool actually is, and discovered that this was a much more likely candidate for the historical Pool of Siloam. On top of that, the archaeologists were able to find coins trapped in the plasterwork that allowed them to date the pool and confirm that it would have been around during the time of Jesus. So you can see that it would have been a very wide public pool. This is just one side of the steps here. They would have also been on this side and well on into this grassy bank here. Now, the reason I'm starting here really is to illustrate that the work of archaeology continues. As time goes on, we keep finding more and more that fits with the details of the gospel accounts in the Bible. That's great, not just because it shows that the Gospels are accurate historical records, but also because seeing some of the places they talk about helps to bring the stories to life. It's easier to imagine what was going on when we can see the places that the Gospels refer to. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing on this tour this evening. I'm going to retell the gist of the Gospel story, and we're going to look at some of the key places where the events happened, so as to bring the story to life in our imaginations. Okay, let's go back to the map view again. Let's begin by zooming out and just having a look at the whole map of Israel so that we can just try and get our bearings a little bit. Now, I'm going to be focusing on Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels because they tell the story of Jesus' life with a fairly simple structure of roughly 2 halves. In the first half, Jesus begins his public life as an adult up here in Galilee, in the northern region around the Sea of Galilee, up here. This is where Jesus went about preaching about God's coming kingdom and performing many signs and miracles. In the second half, Jesus and his disciples make a journey down to Jerusalem, down here in the south. And this is where he comes to confront the temple authorities, and where he will then be executed on the cross and rise from the dead. So we'll be following that rough order, beginning in Galilee and then heading south to Jerusalem. The other gospel writer, John, tells the story a little differently and puts some other trips to Jerusalem in there. So I won't refer to John's account for the sake of simplicity. However, the story actually begins in Bethlehem with Jesus' birth, which is actually in the south. Bethlehem is quite close to Jerusalem. In fact, it's practically a suburb of Jerusalem nowadays. So we're actually going to start in the south before we then go north to Galilee and then head back south again to Jerusalem. Let's find Bethlehem. Bethlehem is down here. As you can see, it's practically a suburb of present-day Jerusalem now. Back to satellite view. And we're going to drop into a hillside just about here in Bethlehem. Okay, here we go. Here we are on the hills outside Bethlehem, and I want you to imagine that there are far fewer buildings here and that you are a shepherd grazing your sheep on the hillside. In Luke's account of Jesus' life, this is roughly where the story begins, when a multitude of angels appear and announce to some shepherds that a saviour has been born to them. Allow me to read from Luke chapter 2. Now, this is going to be very low tech, but bear with me. We're going to flip that over to the side. There we go. And in the same region, there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, who is Christ the Lord." Now, what do those words mean? You may have heard those words countless times at Christmas carol services, but let's just back up a little bit and consider what they actually mean. Why did the angels call Jesus a saviour and Christ the Lord? What would that mean to a bunch of shepherds grazing their sheep on these hills outside Bethlehem in the first century? Well, let me give you just a little bit of historical context. The people of Jesus' day, the Jews, including our shepherds, all believed that they were living in the middle of a long story, and it was a story that seemed to have gone wrong. Even for shepherds living out a simple existence on these hills, their world was in a mess, and they were waiting for God to come back to them and to sort it out and to put it all right. The story goes all the way back into the Old Testament scriptures. The Jews believed that that the one true God of the universe who made the world had chosen them to be his people. Through them, he had a plan to put the whole world right and sort it out. But everything had all gone wrong. Their forefathers had made a mess of their relationship with God, and he had allowed their nation to be captured and taken into exile by the Babylonian Empire. But that was only half of the story. The prophets of that time also promised that God would remain committed to his original plans and purposes for them, and he would forgive them for what they had done, and somehow he would put right everything that had gone wrong. But it had been a long time coming. They had been returned to their land 400 years or so earlier, but little else really seemed to have changed. Empires had come and gone, but they still remained under the foreign occupation. The Romans, the superpower of the time, who were in charge, seemed to them to be a godless, tyrannical force. And so your average shepherd would make a living day by day through gritted teeth. Once a year, they would go to Jerusalem, to the capital city, to the temple, to celebrate the Passover festival, the time when it all began centuries earlier, and God rescued them out of their slavery in Egypt. And they would pray that he would come back and settle the score with the Romans, as he had done with Pharaoh in the past. And he would give them another rescue. One of the prophets whose words stuck vividly in the minds of the people of Jesus' day was the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament, who had described the situation in striking picture language. In chapter 7, he painted a picture of the world as if it was being fought over by savage beasts. Let's just see a picture of that. There's a woodcut by Holbein of Daniel chapter 7. These beasts represented the various empires that rose and fell, full of arrogance and violence. But then at the end of the vision, Daniel described one like a son of man, a true human being, if you like, coming and conquering over the savage beasts. Let's read what Daniel said. "And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away." So come back to our shepherds again, grazing their sheep on the Bethlehem hillside. When the angel appears to them and tells them that a saviour has been born, who is Christ the Lord, this is what it all would have meant to them. A king and a rescuer has been born, one who will lead them into a new age, one who will overthrow the unjust powers and establish a new kingdom, one who will make life wonderful, even for shepherds like them, one like the Son of Man that the prophet Daniel spoke about, who would triumph over their enemies and make everything good. Now we're going to skip forward in time about 30 years or so, and we're also going to head out east. Okay, so as you can see from this terrain view on Google, which is perhaps the clearest way of looking at it, that there's a large expanse of arid desert or wilderness on the eastern side of Israel, which pretty much runs up the length of the country. It's so extensive, in fact, that enemy nations invading from the east in the past had to go quite far north and attack from the north because it's so difficult to get an army across such an arid wilderness. And down through the middle of the wilderness runs the River Jordan here, which runs all the way from the Sea of Galilee in the north up here, all the way down to the Dead Sea down in the south nearer Jerusalem. Let's go back into satellite view and have a look at that in satellite view. Now, this was the region in the wilderness here. This was the region that John the Baptist made his base of operations. We're told in Matthew chapter 3 that John began preaching in the wilderness of Judea, urging everyone to repent and baptizing them in the River Jordan. Let's have a look at the kind of wilderness sort of area close up that John would have been operating in. Sorry, a second. We'll find the right spot. Oh, I've lost it. There we go. Okay, so you get a sense of it here in this picture. Pretty arid, pretty scrubby, not much going on. Of course, there wouldn't have even been roads and buses and cars and so on in John's day. This is the sort of area that John was operating in. But what was he doing in the wilderness? If you think you have an important message that others need to hear, it wouldn't exactly be your first choice of locations to set up shop, would it? What we need to understand is that the wilderness had deep symbolic value. It recalled memories of passages from the prophet Isaiah several hundred years earlier. Isaiah painted a picture of a messenger coming through the wilderness, announcing God's return to his people to make a new kingdom. And John saw his role as that of the messenger, who would get everyone ready before God came back to them. This is also why John took people to the River Jordan to baptize them. It was a symbolic way of showing that you wanted a fresh start and to be ready for God when he came. Now, if we go slightly further east to the River Jordan, we can see the Batson Site that John operated around. Let's have a look. Okay, so you can see a little complex has been built here around what is believed to be the historical site of where John used to baptize people. Now, this is one of those instances where we can't be sure exactly if this was the right spot, but you know, it's a fair bet that it's a fair bet that this would have been the kind of place where John used to come and baptize people in the Jordan. And since the Byzantine period, an actual baptismal pool has been built here in this location, although, as you can see, there's not an awful lot of water in it at the moment. I think you need to bend your knees quite far if you wanted to be baptized in the pool at the moment. Obviously, it's fuller at different times of year. Now, we don't know precisely where it was. As I said, it could be in a number of places along the Jordan, but this would have been where Jesus came to be baptized by John. And we're told in the Gospels that John saw God's Spirit descend upon Jesus like a dove when he came to baptize him. This was the sign John had been waiting for. His job was to prepare the way and to get people ready. And now here was his confirmation that Jesus would be the one in whom God's Spirit would be powerfully at work. So before Jesus did anything publicly as an adult, the air was already thick with anticipation that he would be a new, powerful king, full of God's Spirit. I think many people in the 21st century have a view of Jesus that he was kind of like some sort of hippie character who came along and invented a new religion and told everybody to be cool. But not a bit of it. The expectation of the time was that he would be more like some kind of powerful revolutionary who would establish God's new kingdom. Okay, so now we're going to go north into Galilee, and this is where Jesus actually began his public life. Let's get rid of that. So here we go in the north, in the region of Galilee around the Sea of Galilee. Now, Matthew tells us that Jesus came and lived in the town of Capernaum, which is here on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Let's zoom in and put it into satellite view. Now, Capernaum is little more than a tourist attraction today, really. Let's see it a little bit more close up. But in Jesus' day, it lay on the intersection of some trade routes, so it was a bustling place with many people coming and going. That made Capernaum a good base camp for Jesus, because his mission in Galilee was to announce that God's new kingdom was coming, and he wanted that message to go as far and wide as possible. This is also where Jesus began to perform many signs and wonders to back up his claim. It was in Galilee where he did many of the famous miracles that he's known for. Even if you're not a regular churchgoer, you may know the stories about Jesus healing the paralytic man, or raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, or casting out demons, and so on. These all happened in Capernaum and some of the other towns around the Sea of Galilee. And we're told in Mark chapter 1 that the news spread very rapidly throughout all of Galilee and further beyond, which is a noteworthy feature in itself. Everything that Jesus did in Galilee was publicly attested by many people from Israel and beyond. Now, the point of the miracles that Jesus did wasn't just that he was some kind of nice guy with sort of cool power. They were supposed to go hand in hand with the message that he was preaching, that God's kingdom was arriving and everybody needed to get ready for it. Sometimes people say that Jesus spent all his time hanging out with all the unloved people in society, a little bit like a social worker. And certainly he was happy to welcome anyone and everyone. But actually, Jesus spent much of his time in the synagogues trying to convince people that God's kingdom was coming. In fact, we're told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that so many came to Capernaum for healing from various illnesses that he actually drew a line at a certain point, because he wanted to go to some of the surrounding towns in Galilee and preach in their synagogues as well. And if we zoom out a little bit, we can see just slightly further north, Chorazin, which is here, and Bethsaida, which is just over here, which are mentioned as two of the towns which Jesus went to after being in Capernaum. Now, it was in Capernaum that Jesus also called some of his disciples, such as Simon Peter. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention Jesus going to Simon Peter's house, where he heals Peter's mother-in-law. And archaeologists have excavated a small house that could very well be the house where that all happened, or at least traditionally it's believed to be Peter's house. Let's zoom in and see if we can find it. Here we are just outside the church. You can see that it's actually been built right on top of a little settlement here that was believed to be Peter's house. And if we get another view, we can actually see right inside. Here we go. This is what it's like inside the church. And you can see that they've actually built a glass floor so that you can look down into the dwelling. Now, yet again, it's one of those instances where we can't be sure that this was Peter's house, the actual one that he lived in. Tradition is that that's been the case, and there's been a Byzantine church built there ever since about the 5th century. But even if Peter didn't actually live in this house, it would have been one of the ones nearby. So it gives you a sense of what a settlement would have been like in Capernaum at the very least. Now, as well as the towns around the Sea of Galilee, there are also several significant episodes in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about the sea itself. Some of Jesus's close disciples were fishermen, so getting around by boat was an obvious option. Now we go back, we can see that actually very handily Google has mapped all the way down to this pier here, so we can get a sense of what it would be like to actually walk down the pier onto the Sea of Galilee to board a boat. Here we go, let's go down to the end of this jetty and go and hang out with these 3 chaps at the end for a little bit. And if we catch a different view, I believe we can even get a sense of what it would be like to be out in a boat. Again, some folks are very handily taken some panoramic shots of them on the Sea of Galilee. Let's see if I can find one. Oh yeah, here we go. Brilliant. Okay, so here's a bunch of American tourists out on the Sea of Galilee. You're going to have to imagine that it's a fishing boat. Jolly scene. Not quite sure why they've felt the need to bring their own flag along with them. That's an interesting choice. We've got Israel flags all the way up the rigging here, and 1 stars and stripes on the top. Just wanted to make sure of that, I guess. And here's a guy who's pretending to be on the phone by the looks of it. It's interesting. We're all going to have to imagine that we're out in on a fishing trip on the Sea of Galilee. And one of the most memorable events on the Sea of Galilee is the astonishing record of Jesus calming a storm. The Sea of Galilee is not actually that big. It's more like an oversized lake than a sea. But because it's surrounded by mountains, and I gather also because it's a certain distance below sea level as well, then the wind can come down and kick up some very strong waves. Don't ask me any more about that because I gave up geography after year 9. Maybe it has something to do with eddy currents. That's all I can remember. Anyway, we're told on one occasion when Jesus and the disciples were out in the fishing boat and the wind picked up so violently that there was a huge storm and the disciples were terrified, even the experienced fishermen among them. But Jesus, who had been asleep in the stern as it was picking up, got up and commanded the storm to stop, and immediately it all died down. Mark writes that the disciples, who had been terrified of the storm, were suddenly even more terrified of Jesus when they saw this, and they asked themselves, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" For Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this was one of the defining moments when the disciples got a glimpse of the true authority of Jesus. The implication of their question is that this was no ordinary human. No one in history has had the power to command the natural elements except God himself. Now, that doesn't prove that Jesus actually is God per se, but it does show that he's been given all the power of heaven at his disposal. And that's very significant. Remember, according to the prophet Daniel, the Jews were waiting for one like a son of man to rise up and for God to give him authority over the whole world to establish a new kingdom. The ability to tell the natural elements what to do made Jesus look like a pretty convincing candidate. Now, before we go on, just a couple more comments about the miracles of Jesus. For many reading through the Gospels, this is a point of departure. We find it very hard to believe that such things happen because it doesn't fit with our view of how the world works today. And I sympathize with that. And actually, so would the people of Jesus' day. This sort of thing was just as extraordinary for fishermen out in a boat on the Sea of Galilee as it is for us today. But notice at the very least that these were all public events that were happening. We're told that Jesus went round all the towns in Galilee, and many came to him from far and wide. Even with the calming of the storm, Mark notes that there were several other fishing boats with the boat that Jesus was in. So it's harder to dismiss this stuff than it might first appear. It's very hard to fabricate events that people from far and wide are supposed to have seen, especially when you name some of the people who saw them and some of the places where they happened. Stories about Jesus would already have been in circulation long before they were ever written down. So, for example, if everyone in Capernaum knew Jesus to have been a persuasive teacher, but no one could remember any miracles, then it's not going to take long before Matthew, Mark, and Luke are thrown in the bin when they write down that he did a load of miracles 40 years later or so. The same is true today. We're all talking about Harry and Meghan, what's happening with them at the moment. In fact, my YouTube feed insists on telling me about them, even when I ask it not to. But have a little bit of a think. If somebody was writing a biography about them in 40 years' time, they can't just sort of make stuff up because the stories are already in circulation. We know what's going on. So if somebody wrote, for example, that Harry never even left the UK, even I know that that would be wrong, and I haven't really been following it very closely. So extraordinary though these records are about Jesus in Galilee, because they are public, it makes them much harder to dismiss than private miracles with his disciples would have been. Okay, well, back to Capernaum then, after our little boat trip on the Sea of Galilee together. Now, if we go a little bit further down the coast from Capernaum, we can see a view of a small cove that is also of some significance, with a gentle slope running down to the water's edge, but you can't see that very clearly there, so let me just drop in again. So you can see a couple of little inland coves here and a gentle slope running down to the sea. And somebody has very helpfully in this photograph labeled what I'm about to say about it. This could very well be the spot where Jesus sometimes taught the crowds. We're told in Mark chapter 4, for example, that Jesus went to teach beside the sea. And when great crowds came to him, he got into a boat and spoke to them from there. And this cove would be one of the most natural places to pick to do that. I gather on a day when it isn't too windy, the natural acoustics work such that you can easily hear somebody speaking from a boat, even if you're standing on the shore or even slightly further up the slope. And we're also told that Jesus sometimes went up the hillside to teach the crowds. And again, this slope could well be the very spot where Jesus went to teach the Sermon on the Mount, for example, because it's a natural open space just south of Capernaum. And again, somebody's labelled it in what looks a little bit like a sort of a poor man's Hollywood board. Now, as for the content of what Jesus taught the crowds, we're told in Mark chapter 4 that he taught them many things in parables. Now, as with the miracles, parables were supposed to go hand in hand with his teaching about the coming kingdom. They weren't little stories giving illustrations about life. Actually, they were very subversive and designed to force their listeners to think. If miracles were supposed to illustrate the good news of the kingdom, many of the parables were given as warnings. For example, one of Jesus's most famous parables was about a sower going out to sow a field. And examples of cornfields abounded in the region, so it was easy for people to imagine what he was talking about. In fact, we can see a modern day example if we go just down the road a little bit. Oh, yes, here we go. So you can see an example of a cornfield being grown in the region. Now, the way the parable goes is that a farmer goes out to sow some seed and he scatters some of the seed and it falls on the sort of rocky ground, a bit like here. And he sows some of it and it falls kind of on shallow ground, a bit like here. And he throws some of it so that it falls in amongst the weeds here. And all three of those seeds prove to be unfruitful. They don't grow properly and they don't bear a harvest. But one of the seeds, or some of the seed, falls on good soil and it produces a great crop and a great harvest. That's how the parable goes. Now, what's so subversive about that parable, about the parable of the sower? It's subversive because it's actually describing what is going on within the listeners themselves, as Jesus later reveals to his disciples. Remember, Jesus' listeners all assumed that when God came back and established a new kingdom for them, they would all benefit. But Jesus is forcing them to reconsider. Only some of them will bear a harvest, just as only some of the seed that the farmer scatters bears a harvest. But which ones, and who will they be? That's the question that the parable raises once understood. And this is why Jesus' teaching was so provocative. On the one hand, his message was the gospel, the good news that God's kingdom was coming. On the other hand, his message was unsettling because it questioned whether his listeners were really ready for it. And one of the great surprises about the gospel narratives was exactly who was ready to listen to Jesus' teaching and who wasn't. One of the most shocking rejections actually came from his hometown in Nazareth. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth, which is also in the north, as we'll see in a second. And as part of Jesus' journeys around the towns in Galilee, Jesus went back there, at least on one occasion. And it was here that he got one of the worst receptions. Let's go and have a look at Nazareth. So Nazareth lies just a little bit to the southwest of Capernaum. Just here. And as you can see, it's a pretty rocky, hilly sort of place. Now, ironically, whereas Capernaum would have been a large town, but there's not really anything there anymore, Nazareth would have been just a backwater of a couple of hundred people. But now there's quite a substantial city that has grown up here. So it's sort of been reversed. Now, Luke tells the episode of what happened in Capernaum in the most detail in chapter 4. And he writes that Jesus went to the synagogue and read a famous passage from the prophet Isaiah about the coming of God's new kingdom, declaring that these words were being fulfilled in their hearing. But then he proceeded to give two not very cryptic history lessons that implied that his listeners might not automatically receive the blessings of the kingdom. It would have been a little bit like announcing that the AstraZeneca vaccine was ready to be rolled out, but then telling everyone in the UK that they won't automatically be given it, and maybe it will go to France instead. Can you imagine the outcry? But rather than finding out why Jesus said that, the townsfolk were simply incensed and wanted to get rid of him. And they tried to take him to the top of a nearby cliff and throw him off, although they didn't succeed. Now, if you look carefully, you can see some light-coloured contours on the map around about here. And these are the cliffs that are referred to in the passage. And in fact, if we drop in at this point, we can see a good view. As with everywhere in the Holy Land, then a chapel or a shrine or whatever has been built on the site where all of these things are supposed to have happened. So here we go. Here's a guy holding tight onto his kid's hands. Well, not one of them, because he's trying to take a photograph. But here is the very cliffs that the townsfolk of Nazareth probably came up to throw Jesus off. Now, just as a little aside, notice how Luke just happened to get that topographical detail right. Nazareth was just a small town of a couple of hundred residents, but Luke knows that it was built on a hill and that there were even cliffs where they tried to throw Jesus off. That's remarkably accurate knowledge about a backwater town, which again just goes to show that these events come from sources that were in the right places at the right time. You wouldn't be able to make that sort of stuff up and get it right. So as you can see, Jesus' campaign around Galilee was being met with a mixed reception, despite the miracles that he was performing. This is one of the most astonishing themes of the Gospels. Remember, the Jews had been waiting for centuries for God to come and save them from their enemies and give them a new kingdom. But when Jesus came and gave them all the evidence that he might be the Son of Man, many rejected him. And the reason seems to be that they hated the idea that they might actually have to change to be ready for the kingdom. This is why Jesus went round preaching repentance when he proclaimed the good news as well. The people in Galilee didn't want to hear that bit. And so already, even at this point in the story, when we're a long way from Jerusalem, the reader of the Gospels can see how the shadow of the cross is beginning to fall on Jesus. especially in this instance where the Nazarenes try to throw him off the cliffs. In Mark's narrative, this all builds up to a climax in chapter 8. Having toured around Galilee, Jesus takes the disciples much further north to the settlement of Caesarea Philippi. Let's go and have a look at that. As you can see, through Galilee and then substantially further north to the base of a large mountain called Mount Hermon, and this is where Caesarea Philippi was based. Now, again, there's very little to see of Caesarea Philippi nowadays, but the reason that a settlement sprang up here was because it was a source of natural spring water, which we can see if we drop in. Here we go, 2 more American tourists. Hi, guys. And if we spin around this way, there you go. Here you can see the spring water coming out the mountainside. So it's not hard to see why a settlement would have sprung up here. Now, the reason that Jesus went this far north is probably because of something he wanted to show them up the mountain rather than in Caesarea Philippi itself. But on the way, he has an important conversation with the disciples. This is the moment when he asks them plainly if they know who he really is. And Peter replies that he is the Christ, which is another way of saying the King, the Messiah that they had all been waiting for. He isn't just a great prophet, he's actually the long-awaited King, the Son of Man. And they believe it despite the hostile reception that Jesus has been given in many parts of Galilee. This is the moment of the great plot twist in the narrative, though, because it is at this point, after they've just realized and affirmed that Jesus really is the Christ, that he begins to reveal that he must go to Jerusalem to suffer and to die and then be raised from the dead. Now, in order to understand how much of a plot twist that is, we need to remind ourselves what everybody was expecting once again. The job of the Christ was to come and establish God's new kingdom. That's what Jesus had been announcing in Galilee. He was supposed to go to Jerusalem, overthrow the powers that were in charge, the Romans, and begin a new era for Israel. But to suffer and die, that's not only a slight change of expectations, it's the total opposite. The one thing you need to do to establish a new kingdom is to stay alive. That much is essential. And so the disciples are totally confused. And what happens next is Jesus takes them up a mountain, probably Mount Hermon, which Caesarea Philippi is at the base of, in order to reassure them that he really is the Son of Man. Let's see if we can get a good picture of Mount Hermon. Here we go. So you can see it's actually it's high enough that there is snow on top of Mount Hermon. So it's high mountain range as part of the Anti-Lebanon mountain range. And they've even built a ski slope here nowadays. Now, what happens up Mount Hermon is a very strange event where Jesus is transfigured before the disciples. He appears to them in shining white clothes, and a cloud envelops them, and a voice from heaven declares him to be God's Son, which all sounds kind of trippy. But remember, the disciples have Old Testament imagery in their minds, and so it makes more sense to them. Remember the prophet Daniel, one like a son of man will come on the clouds to God and will be given an everlasting kingdom. And in the final chapter of his book, Daniel also pictures the wise shining like the stars above. So this is all very symbolic to make Jesus look like that character. The point is that he really is the Son of Man, who is about to receive an everlasting kingdom. And everything he's just said about suffering and dying and rising from the dead isn't a mistake. This really is how the Son of Man will bring about a new kingdom. And so begins the journey to Jerusalem in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's narratives. This is where we head south now. Jesus takes his disciples back through the towns of Galilee and Judea, following the River Jordan down towards Jerusalem. So here we go. They would have gone back down towards the Sea of Galilee, through all the towns and cities around Galilee, following the line of the River Jordan Valley down through the middle of the wilderness, because of course the wilderness is very inhospitable, but the Jordan makes a much easier route that you could travel along. And as you get down towards the south, the final major settlement that you would come to would be the fairly substantial city of Jericho here, which is just before you get to the top of the Dead Sea. That's all a relatively straightforward walk following the Jordan. However, the journey from Jericho here to Jerusalem in the west over here is a much more difficult journey, as you can kind of see from the topography on the map. It requires you to go across some really difficult, impassable terrain, which you can kind of see from this sort of dark ridge here on the map. In fact, let me see if I can zoom in and get you some good shots. Yeah, here you go. You get an example of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho here. Look at that winding path along the ravine here in the baking sun. Let's see another example. Yeah, here you can see a path that's been cut into the cliff faces here in the ravine. And so the road to Jericho was a notoriously difficult road, and it was a dangerous road, not just because there weren't many stopping points. Here's some guy doing the journey on his donkey, but also because it was a favorite haunt for bandits to come out and capture travelers who were coming past. It was dangerous for that reason as well. And Jesus uses the road to Jericho as the setting of one of his famous parables of the Good Samaritan, where a man is attacked and left for dead on the road. And just by looking at the picture, you can see why this would be a plausible setting for that parable. Now, when they arrive at Jerusalem, so here we go, you go along all the way through the ravines all the way, and you arrive on the eastern side of Jerusalem over here. Oh, let me just zoom out a bit. There we go. So here we are, we've got to Jerusalem. Just sort of having a look around, just show you the size of it. But the original Jerusalem would have been much smaller, sort of much more in this kind of area. It would have been the walled city area, where you can see it's a little bit lighter on the map. And they would have come to the Mount of Olives, which is here just on the east side of Jerusalem when they arrived, which is what the gospel writers tell us, that they arrive at the Mount of Olives. And this is a good spot as well from which to survey the city, particularly get a good view across to the Temple Mount, which is here. So let's just drop in and have a look at that view from the Mount of Olives. Oh, didn't get that right, sorry. Let's try again. Sorry, that's not a very good view either. Let's try again. Yeah, here we go. That's a better one. So here they built a chapel just on the top of the Mount of Olives. A lot of the olives, of course, have been cleared away now, but you sort of get the idea. And you get a good view across the valley towards the city, and in particular towards the Temple Mount, which is this whole area here. You can still see the outer wall along the edge of it there. Now, from the Mount of Olives, there's a descent down to the east gate of the city, which you can just sort of make out there, that little bit sticking up, whereupon you come to the temple complex. And this is the point where Jesus famously rides down into Jerusalem on a donkey from the Mount of Olives. It's only a short journey, as you can see, just across the valley. So the point of doing it wasn't because he was tired, having walked all the way from Galilee, but because he wanted to reenact the words of another Old Testament prophet, the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah had said that when the king came back to Jerusalem, he would ride in on a humble donkey, not on a war horse. And so Jesus wanted to remind the crowds of that, because it showed them that clearly his intention wasn't to go and have a fight with the Romans. A fight was coming, all right, but it wasn't going to be with them. Instead, he was about to take on the Jews' own temple in Jerusalem. Now, the track from the Mount of Olives, if we go back to satellite view again, the track from the Mount of Olives, as you can see, comes down the hill, down here to the eastern gate, the Golden Gate. Let's have a look at it. So there's the gate that Jesus would have come through. And then as you come through there, you arrive at the northern end here of the Temple Mount, the temple complex. Now you have to imagine that there's a large outer court here, and in the middle is the temple sanctuary, which the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine, has now been built. And I'm going to see if I can call up a picture. There you go. There's a picture alongside a model of what the Temple Mount would have looked like in Jesus's day. Let's drop in here as well and see if we can see a good view on the plateau. There we go. Slightly sort of twilight view, but it'll do. So having come down from the Mount of Olives, Jesus arrived at the temple, and here we are standing on the plateau of the Temple Mount in the outer court. You have to imagine the sanctuary in the middle, as you can see it there on the model, roughly where the Dome of the Rock is now. 400 years earlier, the prophet Malachi had told the people of Jerusalem that the Lord would suddenly come back to his temple in fulfillment of the promises to come back to them. But he warned them to be ready for it when he did. And as we saw in Galilee, many of the people were not ready in the way that Jesus thought they needed to be. But the most surprising part is that it was actually the religious leaders themselves who were consistently the most hostile and resistant towards Jesus. And eventually, it would be they who would arrange for his execution. It's perhaps slightly less surprising that the simple townsfolk of Nazareth didn't want to change their way of life, and so reacted in hostility to Jesus, despite all his wonderful deeds. But it was supposed to be the job of the religious leaders to prepare the way for the Messiah when he came, like John the Baptist had done. One of the most notorious groups that keeps appearing in the gospel accounts is the Pharisees. Again, it's possible to have the wrong view of the Pharisees from Sunday school and think that they were all kind of like pantomime baddies. But really, they were more like a religious pressure group who took it upon themselves to see that everybody took the Bible more seriously. And yet they were the most resistant to Jesus, because he exposed that they too were in need of a heart and a mind change, and they weren't as ready for God to come back as they thought they were. In Luke's narrative, Jesus stands outside Jerusalem and weeps over the city as he comes down, lamenting that now is the time that God is coming back to them through his work, but they don't realize it. In Matthew's narrative, Jesus delivers 7 woes upon the Pharisees and scribes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. And so he comes to the temple and he pronounces condemnation upon them all. But the worst is still to come. You have to imagine, looking at the model and what remains of the plateau, just how impressive the temple looked. For decades before Jesus came, Herod the Great, the puppet king of Israel, had been rebuilding the temple. He turned it into a beautiful edifice made of white stone, far grander than the original second temple had been, that the Jews were only able to manage to build quite cheaply when they returned back from exile in Babylon. In Mark's narrative, the disciples are impressed and they remark on how beautiful it all looks. But Jesus warns them that not only was God about to eject the religious leaders, he was about to tear down the whole temple as well. This would happen within a generation, Jesus said. The temple would be defiled and torn to the ground, and the city surrounded and besieged. But by contrast, the Son of Man, he would be vindicated, and he would gather many people into God's kingdom. In other words, they all expected that when God came back, he would boot out the Romans and make the temple glorious, the house of the Lord. But Jesus declared that it was the temple and its attendants that would be booted out by the Romans, and he would fulfill its role instead. Now, after the showdown in the temple, Jesus took his followers back towards the Mount of Olives and to Bethany, where he was staying with his disciples, which is just on the other side. And this is where he celebrated the Last Supper with them. Let's go back and see that. So here you can see just on the other side of the Mount of Olives here, this region round here is Bethany. The Last Supper was actually a new spin on the Jewish festival of Passover. Remember, Jesus timed his arrival in Jerusalem to coincide with Passover. And Jesus used the symbolic meaning of the Passover festival to explain to his disciples why his death was going to be necessary in all of this. Passover was the celebration of when God had rescued the Jews out of Egypt right back in the beginning with Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues and all of that. It was the moment when God had saved them from their slavery and given them new life. Now, Jesus explained to the disciples, he was about to give his own body to give them life once more. This is what it would look like for the Son of Man to come into his kingdom. It would look like him giving his own life to pay for the sins of all of them, and a fresh new start with God could begin. And one of the most poignant moments in the narrative comes next, as they all go back out to the Mount of Olives and down to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is at the foot of the Mount of Olives. And here's the Mount of Olives here. Here's Gethsemane just here. And as with all of the places, a chapel has now been built on the site, which actually makes it very difficult to get a good view. But let's have a go. Is that the right one? Yeah, here we go. So you still get a sense of the old olive groves here in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is the point where we see the theology of what Jesus said at the Last Supper actually playing out in the real events that followed. The disciples all pledged themselves to Jesus and claimed that they would stick with him to the end, knowing that he was about to be betrayed. But he tells them that they will all fall away. And sure enough, that is what happened. Peter, his closest disciple, not only deserted Jesus, but denied him 3 times. But this is the point. They all betrayed Jesus, but he is giving his life for their sins at the same time, even the very sins that they are committing by betraying him at that moment. And so Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane here and taken to the house of the high priest to be questioned. Now, the traditional site for the high priest's house is the church of St. Peter Gallicantu, which is just to the southwest of the temple. Let's see if we can find it. Here it is. This is the traditional site of the high priest's house. And again, if we drop in, we can see a view of a courtyard which they've made outside, which is sort of reminiscent of the courtyard outside the high priest's house. And the guy with no legs, who you're going to have to imagine is Peter, gathered around the fire outside. Now, what's going on inside the high priest's house is a very interesting conversation between Jesus and the high priest, a conversation full of irony. As far as the high priest is concerned, he and the other religious leaders have all won, and they're about to bring charges that will condemn Jesus and end all his claims to be the Messiah. As far as Jesus is concerned, they are about to condemn themselves, whereas he will be vindicated. From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, he tells the high priest. And in Matthew's account, these are also the words that seal his death sentence. Now, the site of Jesus' crucifixion remains elusive. The only details we're told is that it is the place of the skull. But the Romans crucified lots of people outside the city gates, so it's anyone's guess where that could be exactly. And early tradition has held the site to be where the Church of the Sepulchre is currently located. Let's see if we can find that. just slightly further north and to the west of the temple complex, here we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, supposedly on the site of Jesus's crucifixion. Oh, that's inside the church. I want to be outside it. Sorry, this is remarkably difficult to get the right spot. There we go. So here we are in the courtyard outside the Church of the Sepulchre. And this tradition that this is the site of the crucifixion goes back to at least 330 AD, where the original church was built on this site by, interestingly, none other than Saint Helena. So for those of you who go to St Helen's Church in London like I do, then this is the original St Helen's Church, or at least it was commissioned by St Helen the Great, Constantine's mother. So Jesus was crucified at the place of the skull, having been condemned by the religious authorities and the execution approved by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And as with the scene in the high priest's house, the crucifixion scene, as told by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is also full of irony. The soldiers mockingly give him a crown of thorns and put a sign above his head, saying that he is the King of the Jews. Many bystanders taunt him and ask him if he's not powerful enough to save himself, having saved others. The whole scene is supposed to make Jesus look like a terrible failure. But at the very moment that he dies, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us that the temple curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. And thus the condemnation begins to fall on them, a precursor to greater events that are about to happen in a couple of decades' time. But Jesus' vindication isn't completed until 3 days later, when he is raised from the dead. Now again, the site of the tomb that Jesus was laid in after he was pronounced to be dead by the Roman officials is not known. Of course, this is precisely because the tomb was later found to be empty, so there was no need for the early Christians to remember where it was exactly. It was only several centuries later that it became trendy to try and rediscover biblical sites, and by that time there were no clear records, as with the crucifixion site. But we can see an example of a tomb called the Garden Tomb just north of the city walls that will help us to imagine what the tomb that Jesus was laid in might have looked like. Which, ironically, due to COVID on Google Maps, somebody pointed this out the other day. It says the Garden Tomb, Jerusalem, temporarily closed, which is a nice little ironic point given the subject matter we're discussing. Let's drop in and have a look. Temporarily closed until 3 days later. So here we go. Here's an example of a tomb cut into the cliff face side. There's been a wall that's been built on top here, which would have been kind of typical of the sort of tomb that Jesus might have been laid in. We're told by the gospel writers that rather than being thrown in a common grave with the crucified criminals, which was the Romans' normal practice, instead, Jesus was placed in a private tomb at the request of a wealthy disciple named Joseph of Arimathea. And the tomb would have been cut into the hillside as this one has been. Common practice was to have a slope that sort of led down to the base of the entrance so that you could roll the stone down and use gravity. Easy to get it in, hard to get it back out again. Although you don't really get a sense of that with this one because they've made a courtyard out the front. Very early on the first day of the week, a detail that all the gospel writers make sure they include because of its obvious symbolic value, some of the women went to the tomb to anoint the body with spices. In Mark's narrative, they discuss on the way how they're going to get the stone away from the entrance because it's far too big for them to move. But when they get there, they discover that it's already been rolled away and the grave clothes left behind. Instead, there is an angel there, and he announces that Jesus has risen from the dead, just as he said he would, and he would meet them back in Galilee. Remember the prophecy from Daniel, the Son of Man will come with his angels into his kingdom. And Matthew's account ends with the disciples all reunited on the mountainside in Galilee, at which point he declares to them that all authority in heaven and on earth has now been given to him. At which point, hopefully, the disciples remembered what he had previously said when he was transfigured on Mount Hermon. That was the moment, after he had been raised from the dead, that they would truly see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom. And Matthew's gospel ends with Jesus reassuring the disciples that he will be with them and commissioning them to go and to start bringing people from every nation into God's new kingdom. However, that's not quite the end of the story, because at this point, Jesus' words had not yet fully run their course. Remember that a key part of the package that showed who he really was, that he really was the true Son of Man, was A, that he would rise from the dead and triumph over those who crucified him, but also B, that their condemnation was coming. And this takes us to our final site, which is the western wall of the Temple Plateau. So back to the Temple Plateau again. And we're going to drop in at the western wall. Skip forward in time about 40 years or so. In the year 66 AD, many of the Jewish zealots who were trying to bring about God's new kingdom by force, in other words, the opposite way from how Jesus was doing it, provoked the Roman army. And it was as if a slumbering dragon had been awakened. The Emperor Nero sent a formidable army to teach the Jews a lesson once and for all, and they barricaded Jerusalem in and finally laid siege to the city. It was a horrific slaughter. Finally, they got to the temple and they destroyed the whole thing, taking away all the expensive artifacts back to Rome. So all that remained of Herod's temple was the plateau upon which it was built, which you can still see to this day. Now, one of the fascinating things about all of this is that many scholars, including non-Christian scholars, date the writing of Mark's gospel prior to all of these events. In other words, everything that Jesus said about the coming destruction of the temple happening within a generation, therefore can't have been made up after the event. In fact, I think there's a good case to be made that all four of the Gospels were written before the Jewish war, because they all sort of allude to the events that are coming, but don't spell them out in any kind of detail, which you might expect that they would do if they were writing it later. Now, the Jews were allowed to pick up the pieces of their ruined city after that, but then 60 years later, another rebellion arose, which led the Romans to eject the Jews from the city once and for all and refuse to let them back in except once a year, when they were allowed to come to the western wall of the Temple Plateau, as you can see here, to pray. And over time, the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine, would be built up on the site where the temple sanctuary was on top. And of course, the political ramifications of all of that continue on into the present day. And so here on Google Maps, we can see to this very day, Orthodox Jews still come to the wall to pray. There's still a sense of waiting for God to come back, like he said that he always would, and fulfill his promises to them. But according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that has already happened with the death and the resurrection of Jesus. God's new kingdom has already begun, and the world has been changed and will continue to be so, albeit in a very different way from what the disciples expected when they first walked with Jesus in Galilee.